In the sweltering heat of a Richmond summer in 1849, a black man named Samuel Washington did something that white slaveholders thought impossible. He walked into attorney Jacob Miller's office on Main Street carrying a worn leather pouch heavy with gold coins, placed exactly $1,250 on the polished mahogany desk, and calmly announced that he was there to purchase himself from the man who claimed to own him, becoming the sixth and final buyer in a life that had seen him sold 5 times across 3 states, torn from his mother's arms at age 19, separated from everyone he'd ever loved, worked nearly to death in rice fields and cotton plantations and sugar mills, yet somehow, through a combination of brilliance, strategy, patience, and an iron will that 15 years of bondage couldn't break, he'd saved enough money, penny by penny, dollar by dollar, year after agonizing year, to do what the law said was impossible, to transform himself from property into person, from chattel into citizen, from enslaved to free. Before we dive into Samuel's extraordinary 20-year journey from that first devastating sale to the moment he bought his own freedom, I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel right now and smash that notification bell. We bring you the most powerful, forgotten stories of Black excellence, courage, and genius every single week. Stories that schools don't teach, stories that deserve to go viral. Stories of ancestors whose intelligence and strategic brilliance changed history. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from. We've got viewers in over 60 countries, and we love seeing this global community united in honoring these incredible lives. Now let's go back to August 1834 to a tobacco plantation in Halifax County, North Carolina, where Samuel's world was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't imagine, where everything he knew would be ripped away, where his real education in survival was about to begin. The morning started like any other morning Samuel Washington had known in his 19 years of life. The sun rose over the Turner plantation, casting long golden shadows across the tobacco fields that stretched toward distant pine forests. Birds sang in the oak trees. The air smelled of earth and growing things and wood smoke from cooking fires. Samuel woke in the small cabin he shared with his mother Ruth, a 43-year-old woman whose dark hands were calloused from decades of work, but whose eyes still held fierce intelligence and love. His father Daniel had died 3 years earlier from pneumonia, works in freezing November rain and never given time to recover, buried in the plot behind the quarters where enslaved people laid their dead with ceremonies their African ancestors would have recognized. Samuel had grown up on this plantation, knew every path through the woods, every face in the quarters, every rhythm of planting and harvest. He'd fallen in love with a young woman named Grace, who worked in the big house. He'd imagined, with the desperate hope of the young, that maybe his life would continue here, that maybe he'd marry Grace, that maybe they'd have children who would at least know their grandmother, even if they couldn't know freedom. But Thomas Turner, the white man who owned the plantation and the 137 black people who worked it, had spent the previous 3 months in Raleigh gambling on horse races and card games with other plantation owners. Turner had lost badly. Very badly. Now he owed $8,000 to various creditors who were demanding immediate payment. The solution, as it always was for white men who lived beyond their means on the labor of enslaved people, was to sell human beings to cover debts. Turner had his overseer compile a list of the most valuable young enslaved people, the ones who would fetch the highest prices at auction. Samuel's name appeared third on that list. "Baby, we need to talk." His mother's voice woke him fully that morning, and Samuel knew immediately from her tone that something terrible was coming. Ruth sat on the edge of their shared bed, her face showing the kind of grief that comes when you've already cried all the tears you have, and now there's just hollow acceptance left. "Master Turner's selling people tomorrow. You're on the list." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Selling. Tomorrow. He'd known this could happen. Every enslaved person lived with the constant terror of sale, of separation, of families destroyed by white people's financial decisions. But knowing it was possible and facing its reality were entirely different things. "Mama, no," he said, though even as he spoke, he knew his protest meant nothing. What enslaved people wanted never mattered. Where? Who's buying? "Slave trader coming up from South Carolina," Ruth said quietly, glancing at the cabin door to make sure no one was listening. They had maybe 12 hours left together before Samuel would be taken away forever, and she wasn't going to waste those hours on useless tears. Instead, she was going to teach him everything she could about how to survive what was coming. "Samuel, listen to me carefully because I won't get another chance to tell you this. Your father told me something before he died that I need to pass to you now." Samuel sat up fully, giving his mother his complete attention. Outside, he could hear the plantation waking, other enslaved people starting their day, the overseer's voice shouting orders, the sounds of a place where human beings were worked like machinery. But in this cabin, in these final hours with his mother, Samuel focused entirely on her words. "Your daddy was a smart man," Ruth continued, her voice steady despite the pain Samuel could see in her eyes. "Smarter than white folks ever knew. He told me that the only way to survive being sold, and he was sold 3 times before ending up here, is to understand that you're playing a game where they make all the rules, but that doesn't mean you can't learn to play it better than they expect. He said you have to watch everything, learn everything, remember everything, because knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you once it's in your head. They can sell your body, but they can't sell what you know." "Mama, I don't understand," Samuel said, fear making his voice shake. "How is knowing things supposed to help me when some white man can just sell me wherever he wants, work me however he wants, do whatever he wants to me?" Ruth reached out and grabbed her son's face with both hands, forcing him to look directly into her eyes. "Because knowledge is power, even when you don't have freedom," she said intensely. "Samuel, wherever they send you, you watch how things work. You learn skills that make you valuable. You figure out what white folks want, and you give them just enough of it to survive while keeping your real self hidden where they can't touch it. And most important, you save money. Every penny you can, however you can, because money is the one language white folks respect above everything else. And if you can ever get enough money, you might be able to buy yourself. I've heard of it happening. Not often, but it happens." Buy myself? The concept seemed absurd. Samuel was property worth maybe $600 or $700 based on his age and health. How could property accumulate enough money to purchase itself? "Mama, that's impossible." "It's nearly impossible," Ruth corrected. "There's a difference. Nearly impossible means there's a path, even if it's a path that takes decades and requires you to be smarter and more patient than you ever thought you could be. Your goal now, not revenge, not fighting back in ways that'll get you killed, but your goal is freedom. Real, legal freedom. And the only way most enslaved people ever get that is by using the system's own tools. By being so valuable that white folks will negotiate with you. By saving money they let you earn. By, eventually, buying yourself." Samuel felt like his mother was describing a fantasy, a dream so distant it might as well not exist. But he also recognized something in her intensity, something that told him this wasn't just hopeful wishing. This was a strategy his father had understood, a path that actually existed, even if it was incredibly difficult. "How long would something like that take?" he asked quietly. "Years," Ruth said honestly. "Maybe 10 years, maybe 20. Maybe you'd be middle-aged before you saved enough. But Samuel, what else are you going to do? Just survive day to day with no purpose? Just let them work you until you're broken? Your father taught me that the difference between surviving and slowly dying is having a goal, having something you're working toward, even if it seems impossible." "How long would something like that take?" he asked quietly. "Years," Ruth said honestly. "Maybe 10 years, maybe 20. Maybe you'd be middle-aged before you saved enough. But Samuel, what else are you going to do? Just survive day to day with no purpose? Just let them work you until you're broken? Your father taught me that the difference between surviving and slowly dying is having a goal, having something you're working toward, even if it seems impossible.
That goal gives you reason to stay sharp, to stay smart, to keep your humanity when everything around you is trying to take it away. They talked through the night, Ruth teaching her son everything she could think of that might help him survive. She taught him about reading people, about understanding what different white folks valued so he could give them what they wanted while protecting his inner self. She taught him about patience, about thinking in years rather than days, about strategic planning rather than desperate reactions. She taught him about community among the enslaved, about building relationships that could provide support and information and sometimes protection. She taught him about maintaining dignity even when everything was designed to strip dignity away. "When they sell you tomorrow," Ruth said as dawn approached, "you keep your face neutral. Don't show anger. That makes you seem dangerous and hard to manage, drives your price down, or gets you bought by someone brutal who thinks they need to break you. Don't show fear. That makes you seem weak. Don't show sadness. That makes them think you're going to be a problem. You show them nothing. Just stand there with dignity, answer questions if asked, and remember that whatever happens on that auction block, it doesn't define who you really are. They're selling your body, Samuel. They can't sell your mind or your spirit unless you let them." The auction took place at noon the next day in the Halifax County Courthouse. Samuel stood on the wooden platform alongside 11 other enslaved people, men, women, a teenage girl who couldn't stop crying, an older man who'd been sold so many times he just looked hollowed out. White men circled like predators, examining human merchandise, checking teeth like they were buying horses, feeling muscles, asking questions about health and work history and temperament. Samuel felt hands on him, white hands that treated him like an object, and he forced himself to remain still and expressionless, even though rage burned in his chest like fire. "This one looks strong," a white man said to his companion, grabbing Samuel's arm to check muscle tone. "Good build. Probably worked tobacco or cotton. What's his temperament like?" The slave trader, a man named William Benton, who made his living buying and selling human beings, stepped forward with a ledger. "Samuel, age 19, raised on Turner Plantation. Good worker, no discipline problems, healthy stock. Father worked this plantation 30 years before dying. Mother still here, house servant. Boys got good breeding, should give you 15 or 20 years of prime labor." Samuel wanted to scream that he wasn't livestock, that his breeding wasn't about bloodlines, but about his parents' intelligence and strength and love, that reducing his father's life to "worked 30 years before dying" was an obscenity. But he kept his face neutral, kept his mother's teachings in his mind, kept his true feelings locked deep inside where white people couldn't see them. The bidding started at $400 and climbed quickly. A plantation owner from South Carolina named William Harrison bid aggressively, competing with 2 other planters who wanted young, strong workers. The price reached $650, then $680, then $700. Samuel stood on the platform thinking about his mother, watching from the crowd of enslaved people who'd been brought to witness this, thinking about Grace, who was crying openly, thinking about everything he was losing. When the hammer finally fell, William Harrison had paid $725 for Samuel, a significant sum that reflected his age, his strength, his potential for decades of productive labor. Harrison signed paperwork with efficient business movements, arranged for Samuel to be transported to his cotton plantation near Columbia, South Carolina, and departed without once looking Samuel in the eye or acknowledging that he'd just purchased a human being with thoughts and feelings and a life that mattered.
But as Samuel was loaded into a wagon alongside 4 other newly purchased enslaved people, as he caught one last glimpse of his mother standing straight-backed and dignified despite the tears streaming down her dark face, he made himself a promise that would sustain him through everything that followed. I will buy myself. I don't know how long it'll take. I don't know exactly how I'll do it, but I will become the 6th and final person to buy Samuel Washington. I will be free. This is not the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a different chapter. The Harrison plantation sprawled across 800 acres of South Carolina Piedmont, its fields planted with cotton that stretched to distant tree lines like a white ocean during harvest season. Samuel arrived in September 1834 to find a plantation operating with brutal efficiency. 43 enslaved black people working dawn to dusk under an overseer named Robert Crawford, who believed that the only way to manage enslaved labor was through constant surveillance and quick, harsh punishment for any perceived laziness or resistance. The quarters where enslaved people lived were rough wooden cabins, overcrowded and poorly maintained. The food was barely adequate. Cornmeal, salt pork, whatever vegetables people could grow in small garden plots they were permitted to tend on Sundays. The labor was backbreaking. Picking cotton in heat that regularly exceeded 95 degrees, fingers bleeding from sharp cotton bolls, backs aching from bending over plants hour after hour. But Samuel didn't just endure the work, he observed. He watched how the plantation operated, looking for inefficiencies, for opportunities, for ways the system could be understood and potentially navigated. He noticed that Crawford, despite his brutality, was actually quite lazy. The overseer spent hours drinking whiskey in the shade while enslaved people worked largely unsupervised in distant fields. He noticed that the cotton gin machinery frequently broke down because no one properly maintained it, leading to harvest delays that cost Harrison money. He noticed that supplies were wasted through poor inventory management, that crop rotation wasn't practiced properly, that soil quality was declining because no one was paying attention to agricultural science. Harrison himself rarely visited the plantation, preferring to stay in Columbia managing his other business interests, relying on Crawford's reports which consistently overstated productivity and understated problems. Within Samuel's first 2 months, he identified something crucial. The plantation had a skilled blacksmith named Joshua, a 50-year-old black man who repaired tools and equipment. Joshua was permitted to take outside work from neighboring plantations to generate additional income, and Harrison allowed Joshua to keep 20% of those earnings for himself. This arrangement existed not because Harrison was generous, but because he'd calculated that skilled tradespeople could generate revenue beyond fieldwork, and allowing them to keep a small percentage provided motivation for quality work, while the owner kept the vast majority. Samuel began spending his limited free time near the blacksmith shop, watching Joshua work, asking questions when appropriate, slowly building a relationship. "You're curious," Joshua observed one Sunday evening after Samuel had spent an hour watching him repair a broken plow blade. "Most field hands don't pay attention to this kind of work. Why you interested?" "Because I want to learn skills that might give me value beyond just field labor," Samuel replied honestly. "My mama taught me before I was sold that the only way to survive this system is to make yourself valuable in ways that might eventually create opportunities. I don't know what those opportunities might be yet, but I figure learning blacksmithing is better than just picking cotton until my body gives out." Joshua studied Samuel carefully, his dark eyes assessing something beyond the words. "You're thinking long-term," he said slowly. "Most people in bondage can't think past tomorrow because tomorrow's so hard. But you're thinking about years from now, aren't you? About having goals beyond just surviving the next day. My daddy was sold 3 times before he ended up on Turner Plantation where I was born. He told my mama that the way to survive multiple sales, the way to keep your humanity when everything's trying to take it, is to have a long-term goal, even if that goal seems impossible. My goal is to eventually buy my freedom. I know that sounds crazy. I'm 19 years old, been enslaved my whole life, just got sold for $725, which might as well be $1 million. But that's my goal.
And I figure learning valuable skills is step one toward maybe eventually earning money that could add up to something. It'll take decades, Joshua said bluntly. I've saved $43 over 15 years from my percentage of outside work. That's working as a skilled blacksmith with permission to take paid outside jobs. And $43 isn't enough to buy my breakfast, let alone buy my freedom. I'd need at least $1,000 for that. But you're right that having the goal matters. Gives you reason to stay sharp, to keep learning, to not let them break your spirit. I'll teach you what I can when time permits, but you need to understand that Crawford doesn't like field hands developing skills. He thinks it makes you uppity, makes you think you're worth more than he says you're worth. You'll need to be careful. Over the following months, Samuel learned basic blacksmithing during stolen moments. Early mornings before field work, brief evening hours, occasional Sundays when Crawford was too drunk to notice. Joshua taught him how to recognize good iron from brittle material, how to heat metal to proper temperature by observing color, how to shape it with different hammer techniques, how to repair common tools and implements. The knowledge accumulated slowly, piece by piece, skill by skill. Samuel made mistakes, burned himself, created useless pieces of misshapen metal, but gradually, painfully, he became competent enough to assist Joshua with simpler repairs. But then, in December 1835, just 16 months after Samuel had arrived at the Harrison plantation, just as he was beginning to develop skills and imagine a possible future path, everything shattered again. William Harrison died suddenly from a heart attack at age 47. His estate entered probate. Everything he owned, land, buildings, equipment, livestock, and the human beings he'd enslaved, would be sold to settle his considerable debts and distribute whatever remained among his relatives. Samuel, who'd been carefully building knowledge and relationships and planning for a future that would take years to achieve, found himself once again reduced to property to be liquidated for someone else's financial benefit. The second sale happened in Columbia in January 1836. Samuel stood in cold winter air on an auction platform while white men evaluated him just as they had 18 months earlier, except now he was slightly older, visibly stronger from hard labor, and had developed skills that increased his market value. The auctioneer described him as strong field hand with basic blacksmithing skills, no discipline problems, good investment for cotton or rice plantation. The bidding reached $740, reflecting his increased value. The winning bidder was a rice planter named Robert Caldwell, who owned extensive holdings in Georgetown District near the coast. And this was where Samuel's story took a darker turn, because rice plantations in South Carolina's Low Country were known as death fields among enslaved people. Rice cultivation required flooding fields with water channeled from rivers, creating conditions where mosquitoes bred prolifically, where malaria and yellow fever and dysentery killed workers at appalling rates. Life expectancy for enslaved people on rice plantations was significantly shorter than on cotton or tobacco farms. Caldwell knew this, calculated it into his business model. Rice profits were so high that they exceeded the cost of constantly replacing workers who died. Samuel was being sent to a place where survival past 10 years was remarkable and survival past 20 years was nearly unheard of. But Samuel didn't die. He survived through a combination of luck, constitution, intelligence, and the kind of strategic thinking his mother had taught him. He watched which areas of the flooded rice fields seemed to generate more illness and tried to avoid working those sections when possible. He paid attention to who got sick and what they'd eaten or where they'd been, looking for patterns that might help him reduce his own risk. Even though he didn't understand germ theory, he just noticed correlations and acted on them. He developed relationships with other enslaved people who'd survived longer, listening to their strategies for staying alive in an environment designed to kill them. And crucially, Samuel discovered that the rice plantation, despite its brutality, actually operated with more specialized labor divisions than the cotton farm had.
Beyond field workers, Caldwell employed coopers who made barrels for shipping rice, carpenters who built and maintained structures, boatmen who transported goods to Georgetown for sale, seamstresses who made and repaired clothing. These specialized workers often had opportunities to earn small amounts of money through work performed during their limited free time, usually Sunday afternoons. Samuel, who'd learned blacksmithing basics from Joshua, found that other enslaved people needed tools repaired and were willing to pay a few pennies for that service. "You're going to get yourself in trouble," a 20-year-old woman named Mary warned him one Sunday evening after watching Samuel repair a hoe for another slave in exchange for 3 pennies. Mary had been born on the Caldwell plantation, had watched countless people arrive and die from disease, had developed protective instincts to avoid anything that might draw overseer attention. "Crawford hears you're operating like a tradesman, taking money from other slaves. He'll think you're getting above yourself. He'll make an example of you to keep the rest of us scared." "I'm just helping people and saving pennies," Samuel replied quietly, tucking the 3 cents into a small cloth bag he kept hidden under the floorboards of his cabin. "Not hurting anybody, not breaking any rules, just trying to stay alive, and maybe, eventually, have enough saved that it actually matters for something." "How much you got saved after being here a year?"
Mary asked, curiosity overcoming her caution. 68 cents, Samuel said, and even speaking the number made him realize how absurdly small it sounded. He needed more than $1,000 to buy himself. At this rate, saving pennies from occasional tool repairs, it would take him literally decades, even if he could keep saving steadily, which he probably couldn't. Most enslaved people never accumulated money because there were too few opportunities to earn it and too many ways for any savings to be stolen or confiscated or lost. "That sounds like nothing," Mary said, not cruelly but realistically. "It is almost nothing," Samuel agreed. "But my mama taught me that you survive by having a goal, even if that goal seems impossible. The act of working toward it keeps you human, keeps you from giving up completely. So I save pennies, even though it would take me 60 years to save enough to buy myself at this rate. Because saving pennies reminds me that I have a purpose beyond just trying not to die tomorrow. That purpose keeps me sharp, keeps me thinking, keeps me watching for better opportunities that might come along." Mary was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say something similar, that the difference between surviving and dying slowly was keeping purpose in your heart. She died 5 years ago from fever, but she kept that purpose right until the end. Maybe you'll actually make it, Samuel. Maybe you're one of those people who figures out how to get free." But 3 months later, in April 1836, just as Samuel was beginning to establish himself and accumulate small savings, Robert Caldwell made a business decision that would shatter Samuel's life for the 3rd time. Rice prices had climbed so high that Caldwell calculated he could sell 30 of his enslaved workers to a trader for premium prices, use those proceeds for other investments, and replace the sold workers with cheaper purchases from declining tobacco regions of Virginia and Maryland. Samuel, who'd only been on the rice plantation 15 months and hadn't yet become indispensable in any specialized role, made the list of 30 to be sold. The 3rd sale was different from the previous 2, more brutal, more dehumanizing, more terrifying in every way. Instead of being sold at a public auction to a local buyer, Samuel was sold to a slave trader named Andrew Mitchell, who specialized in assembling large coffles of enslaved people for transport to the expanding cotton frontier of the Deep South, where demand and prices were higher than anywhere else. Mitchell paid Caldwell $780 for Samuel, a good price reflecting his youth, strength, and skills. Then immediately chained Samuel together with 46 other people for a forced march that would take them more than 600 miles over 6 weeks to reach Natchez, Mississippi. The coffle journey was 6 weeks of hell on earth. 47 black people chained together in pairs, walking 15 to 20 miles per day through spring heat that climbed towards summer, sleeping in open fields or rough pens, fed minimal rations of cornmeal and salt pork, denied even the most basic dignity or respect, treated as livestock being moved from one market to another. 3 people died during the march, one from illness, one from exhaustion and heat stroke, one woman after giving birth on the side of the road and hemorrhaging to death while the coffle was forced to keep walking. Children cried at night for parents they'd been separated from. Women were vulnerable to assault from Mitchell and his drivers, who saw enslaved women as having no rights worth respecting, no bodily autonomy that white men were required to honor. An elderly man collapsed after 4 days and was simply left by the road, his chain removed, his body abandoned where it fell. Samuel walked those 600 miles chained to a young man named Peter, who'd been torn from his wife and infant son in Charleston. Peter wept silently for the first 2 weeks, tears streaming down his dark face while his body mechanically kept walking, kept surviving, kept moving forward even though everything that had given his life meaning had been destroyed. Eventually the tears stopped, replaced by a hollow emptiness that was somehow worse than grief. The look of someone whose spirit had been broken so completely that he was just a body going through motions, waiting to die. "How do you keep going?" Peter asked Samuel during one evening rest stop, his voice completely flat. "How do you not just give up? What's the point of surviving this?" Samuel didn't have a good answer. How could he? The evil of slavery was precisely that it destroyed purposes, separated families, made long-term planning impossible for most people trapped in its machinery. But he thought about what his mother had taught him, about having goals even when goals seemed impossible, and he tried to articulate something that might give Peter a reason to keep breathing. "I remember what my mother told me before my first sale," Samuel said slowly, not sure if his words would help or just sound like empty philosophy. "She said you survive by keeping purpose, by having a goal even when that goal seems impossible. My goal is to buy myself someday. Might take decades, might never happen, but working toward it keeps me alive, keeps me feeling like I'm still a person with agency, even when I'm treated like property. What was your goal before they sold you, Peter?" "My goal was my family," Peter said bitterly. "My wife, Hannah, my son, Jacob, who's 6 months old. That was my whole purpose, being a good husband, a good father, protecting them as much as I could in this evil system. Now they're gone. I'll never see them again. That family's been destroyed. What purpose am I supposed to find in that?" Samuel didn't have an answer that would make Peter's situation anything but what it was. A tragedy, a destruction of human bonds, an evil so profound that trying to find meaning in it felt obscene. But he tried anyway, because what else could he do? Maybe your purpose now is to survive, so that if there's ever a chance, maybe after years, maybe through some change in the system we can't predict, if there's ever a chance to find them again, you're still alive to take it. Maybe your purpose is to honor your wife and son by not letting this system break you so completely that you give up. I don't know, Peter. I'm just trying to figure out how to keep walking myself. But maybe we keep walking together, help each other survive, and somewhere down the line we find purposes worth living for." Peter didn't respond, but he also didn't give up. He kept walking. They all kept walking, because what else could they do? The coffle reached Natchez, Mississippi in late May 1836, and Mitchell began selling his human merchandise through a local broker to various buyers throughout Mississippi and Louisiana. Samuel, marked in the sales ledger as strong field hand age 20, blacksmithing skills, survived rice plantations, good health, no discipline problems, attracted interest from multiple planters who competed for young, strong, skilled workers. The winning bidder was Charles Thornton, a cotton planter who owned 1,200 acres in Adams County just outside Natchez.
Thornton paid $825 for Samuel, the highest price yet, reflecting both Samuel's increasing value and the premium prices that prevailed in the expanding cotton economy of the Deep South, where fortunes were being made by white men whose wealth came entirely from black people's stolen labor. This was Samuel's third owner in less than 2 years, his third forced adjustment to new circumstances, his third destruction of whatever tiny stability he'd managed to build. But Thornton proved to be different from Harrison and Caldwell in ways that would matter enormously to Samuel's long-term plans. Thornton was a calculating businessman who thought about labor management in sophisticated ways beyond simple brutality. He believed that enslaved people produced more profit if given certain limited incentives, slightly better food, small privileges, even tiny amounts of autonomy, while simultaneously maintaining absolute control through the ever-present threat of violence. He operated his plantation like a corporation, with enslaved people divided into specialized roles, with clear hierarchies, with reward systems designed to create competition among the enslaved that reduced collective resistance while increasing individual productivity. "I've reviewed your history," Thornton told Samuel during an interview 3 weeks after purchase, a conversation that shocked Samuel because most enslavers never bothered talking to enslaved people like human beings capable of conversation. "You have basic blacksmithing skills according to the sales records. My head blacksmith Ezra is 54 years old and needs assistance to keep up with equipment maintenance for the plantation. I'm going to try you in the smithy working under Ezra's supervision. If you prove capable, you'll be moved from field work permanently. That means better quarters, better food, and the possibility of earning small amounts through outside work. Of course, it also means higher expectations. Failure to meet those expectations carries severe consequences. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, Master Thornton," Samuel replied, keeping his voice neutral and respectful while his mind raced with the implications. This was the kind of opportunity his mother had taught him to watch for, chances to develop valuable skills that might eventually lead toward resources needed for self-purchase. But it was also dangerous because Thornton was explicitly saying that failure would be punished severely, meaning Samuel would be under intense scrutiny, where any deficiency could result in brutal consequences. Samuel worked under Ezra for the next 2 years, learning advanced metalworking techniques that went far beyond the basics Joshua had taught him on the Harrison plantation. Ezra was a master craftsman, a 54-year-old black man who'd been blacksmithing since age 14, who possessed knowledge and skill that would have made him wealthy in any just world, but instead generated profit for the white man who owned him. Ezra could forge complex parts for cotton gin machinery, could repair steam engines, could create specialized tools and implements that plantation operations required. He taught Samuel how to work with different metals, how to assess structural integrity, how to diagnose mechanical problems and design solutions, how to manage a workshop efficiently. But Ezra also taught Samuel something equally important: how to navigate Thornton's system. "Thornton's watching you constantly, even when you don't see him," Ezra explained one afternoon while they worked on repairing a broken cotton press mechanism. "He's calculating whether you're worth the investment of training, whether you'll generate more value as a skilled smith than as a field hand. You need to show him you're valuable enough to keep in this position, but not so valuable that he decides to tighten control because he's afraid of losing his investment. It's a delicate balance. You be very good at the work, excellent even, but you also be steady, reliable, not flashy. That way, he sees you as a dependable asset generating consistent returns rather than a potential problem that needs extra management." Samuel learned that balance over 2 years of intensive work. He became an excellent blacksmith, capable of handling most plantation maintenance needs independently, and of taking paid work from neighboring plantations on Sundays. Thornton, true to his word, allowed Samuel to keep 20% of earnings from outside work, the same arrangement Samuel had heard about from Joshua years earlier. It wasn't generous, it was exploitative, Thornton was taking 80% of money Samuel earned through his own labor in his supposed free time. But it was also an opportunity to accumulate savings at a much faster rate than fieldwork pennies. Over 2 years working as Thornton's blacksmith, Samuel saved $36. Combined with small amounts he'd managed to keep from previous plantations, he now had $43 total. Still nowhere near the $1,000+ he'd need for self-purchase, but progress nevertheless. Progress that felt significant because it represented years of strategic thinking, careful saving, patient accumulation toward a goal that remained distant but no longer entirely impossible. At this rate, if he could maintain the pace, he might save enough in another 20 or 25 years, maybe less if opportunities arose for higher-paying work. But in April 1838, Charles Thornton made a series of disastrous investment decisions. He'd speculated heavily on cotton futures, betting that prices would rise based on his analysis of market conditions. He was wrong. Cotton prices collapsed. Thornton suddenly owed more than $15,000 to various creditors who demanded immediate payment. His solution, like so many enslavers before him when facing financial trouble, was to sell human beings to generate liquid capital. Samuel, along with 15 others, including Ezra, would be sold to cover Thornton's gambling losses. "I'm sorry, Samuel," Ezra said the night before the sale, genuine sadness in his weathered voice. "I was hoping you'd be here long enough to really master the craft, maybe eventually save enough to buy yourself. But this is how the system works. We build lives, and they tear them down whenever it's profitable or necessary for them. You take what you've learned, and you keep surviving. That's all any of us can do. That's our form of resistance. We keep surviving, keep maintaining our humanity, keep working toward goals even when those goals seem impossible." The fourth sale happened at a Natchez auction house in April 1838. Samuel stood before buyers with 3.5 years of advanced blacksmithing experience, with visible competence in a highly valuable skilled trade. The auctioneer described him in detail. Age 23, excellent health, master-level blacksmith trained by top craftsmen, complex metalwork and machinery repair, no discipline problems, proven reliable worker. Gentlemen, this is a premium purchase that will add immediate value to your operations. The bidding was aggressive. A Louisiana sugar planter named Gregory Morrison competed fiercely with 2 other buyers, driving the price up rapidly. When the hammer finally fell, Morrison had paid $975 for Samuel, a massive sum reflecting his advanced skills and youth. This was now the 4th time Samuel had been sold, the 4th forced relocation, the 4th destruction of whatever small stability he'd managed to build, the 4th time his life had been completely reorganized by white men's financial decisions. Morrison operated multiple sugar plantations in Lafourche Parish, Louisiana, properties that generated enormous wealth through some of the most brutal labor conditions anywhere in the South. Sugar cultivation required intense work during harvest and processing season, grinding season they called it, when enslaved people worked 18 to 20-hour days for weeks on end, when accidents with grinding and boiling machinery maimed and killed regularly, when exhaustion pushed human bodies past sustainable limits. But Morrison also recognized that complex sugar processing equipment required skilled maintenance, and he was willing to invest in a workshop of enslaved craftsmen who kept his profitable operations running smoothly. Samuel became one of Morrison's plantation blacksmiths, working primarily on the extensive machinery involved in sugar processing. The mills that crushed cane, the rollers that extracted juice, the massive kettles where juice was boiled, the various mechanisms that turned raw cane into refined sugar and molasses. The work was technically challenging, requiring advanced metalworking skills and sophisticated mechanical understanding. Samuel found himself learning things he hadn't known were possible: how to forge replacement parts for complex multi-stage equipment, how to strengthen metal components to withstand extreme heat and pressure, how to diagnose subtle mechanical problems before they caused major failures, how to design improvements to existing systems. Morrison, like Thornton, permitted skilled workers to take outside-paying work during limited free time. But Morrison went further, offering an arrangement that was more financially favorable than any Samuel had encountered. "You keep my equipment running smoothly through grinding season without major failures," Morrison told Samuel after 6 months of excellent performance, "and I'll increase your percentage of outside earnings to 30% instead of the standard 20. More importantly, I'll allow you to purchase your free time on Sundays at a set rate, $2 per day. That means if you want to work on Sunday doing outside jobs instead of resting, you pay me $2 for that day and keep everything you earn beyond that amount. Good business. You're motivated to work efficiently because you profit directly. I get rent on your time plus well-maintained equipment. Everybody benefits." Except Samuel didn't benefit equally from his own labor. Morrison's arrangement was structured to ensure the enslaver captured majority value even from Samuel's so-called free time work. But Samuel also understood that this was the best opportunity he'd yet encountered for accumulating serious money. If he could earn $8 or $10 on a Sunday through outside work, which was possible for an expert blacksmith during grinding season when equipment failures cost planters enormous sums and they'd pay premium rates for immediate repair, then after paying Morrison's $2 rent on the day, he'd net $6 to $8 for himself. Done consistently over months and years, that could accumulate to substantial sums. So Samuel worked with intensity that bordered on obsession. He worked maintaining Morrison's equipment with such skill that machinery rarely failed even under the brutal stress of grinding season. He worked outside jobs on Sundays, traveling to neighboring plantations to repair their equipment, building a reputation throughout Lafourche Parish as an expert smith who could solve difficult mechanical problems quickly. And he saved obsessively, maintaining the iron discipline his mother had taught him years earlier, the understanding that every dollar represented potential freedom rather than immediate comfort or pleasure. Between 1838 and 1843, 5 years on the Morrison plantation, Samuel saved $287. Combined with the $43 from earlier years, he now had $330 total. Real money, substantial money, the kind of sum that represented genuine possibility rather than just theoretical hope. He was 28 years old, had been enslaved his entire life, had been sold 4 times, and for the first time, his freedom dream didn't seem completely impossible. At current pace, if opportunities continued, he might accumulate enough for self-purchase within another decade. Maybe less if grinding seasons remained profitable and equipment repair work stayed consistently available. During these years, Samuel also did something that transformed his emotional life. He married. Her name was Hannah, a 30-year-old black woman enslaved on Morrison's plantation who worked as a seamstress, maintaining clothing for the 200-plus enslaved workforce. They had no legal right to marry. Enslaved people couldn't form legally recognized marriages under laws that defined them as property without rights to form contracts or families. But they formed a bond recognized and honored by their community through a ceremony led by an enslaved creature who combined Christian liturgy with African traditions, a commitment made despite the system's refusal to acknowledge black relationships as legitimate or permanent. "You know they can separate us at any moment," Hannah said when Samuel first approached her about marriage, her dark eyes showing both hope and fear. "Morrison can sell you or me tomorrow, and there's nothing we could do about it. How do you make lifetime commitments in a situation like that? How do you build a family when family bonds mean nothing to the people who control our lives?" "The same way we do everything else," Samuel replied, taking her hands in his calloused smith's hands. "We choose to love and commit even in circumstances that try to make love impossible. The fact that they can separate us doesn't mean our choice to be together is meaningless. It means our choice matters more because we're making it despite everything stacked against us. Besides," he added with a slight smile that softened his usually serious face, "I'm working toward buying myself. When I do that, I'll work to buy you next. Might take years, might take decades, but that's the plan. We build a life together even in bondage, and we work toward building a life together in freedom." They married in 1841 according to enslaved community traditions, jumping the broom, making vows before witnesses, celebrating with whatever food and music the community could manage, creating a partnership that provided emotional sustenance in a context designed to destroy black emotional well-being. Hannah supported Samuel's obsessive saving, contributing small earnings from taking in sewing work for other enslaved people, and occasionally for free black people in nearby towns. Together, they accumulated resources while building a relationship that honored their humanity in a system that denied their full humanity every single day. Their daughter Rose was born in February 1842, a beautiful baby girl whose existence simultaneously represented profound joy and terrible terror. Joy because she was their creation, living proof that love could persist and create new life despite oppression, a child who carried their hopes and dreams. Terror because she was born enslaved, property of Gregory Morrison from her first breath, subject to all the horrors that defined black existence under slavery, vulnerable to being sold away from them at any moment if Morrison's financial situation changed or if he simply decided it was profitable to separate them. Samuel looked at his infant daughter and felt responsibility unlike anything he'd experienced before. He wasn't just working toward his own freedom anymore. He was working toward his family's freedom, a vastly more expensive goal that would require amounts of money that seemed impossible even with his improved earning capacity. "I need to find a way to accumulate money faster," Samuel told Hannah as they held their newborn daughter in their small cabin behind the blacksmith workshop. "At my current pace, I might save enough to buy myself in 10 more years. But buying all 3 of us would take 30 or 40 years at this rate. Rose would be middle-aged before we'd all be free. There has to be a faster path. Or there has to be change in the system itself," Hannah said thoughtfully, rocking Rose gently while the baby nursed. "I hear whispers sometimes from people who travel through here. Whispers about northern states where slavery's illegal, about abolitionists working to end slavery everywhere, about growing tensions between North and South that might lead to some kind of conflict. Maybe we won't need to save $3,000 to buy 3 people. Maybe the system itself changes before we'd accumulate that much."
Samuel wanted to believe that, desperately wanted to believe that external forces might end slavery before he'd need to accumulate impossible sums of money. But he'd learned through 9 years and 4 sales not to rely on circumstances beyond his control. Change might come, the system might collapse, slavery might end, but betting his family's future on possibilities rather than on concrete plans seemed irresponsible. He would continue his primary strategy of saving towards self-purchase while remaining open to other opportunities if they arose, but he wouldn't count on divine intervention or political change to save him. But in November 1843, 20 months after Rose's birth, Gregory Morrison announced plans that would destroy Samuel's world yet again. Morrison planned to sell 30 enslaved people to traders assembling coffles for transport to Texas. The Texas Republic had recently been annexed by the United States, opening vast new territories for cotton cultivation, creating unprecedented demand for enslaved labor that was driving prices to record highs. Morrison saw opportunity to generate enormous profits by selling workers to Texas traders who would pay premium prices, then using proceeds to purchase cheaper replacement labor from Upper South states where tobacco's decline was reducing enslaved people's market value. Samuel's name appeared on Morrison's list. The sale would separate him from Hannah and Rose, would destroy the family they'd formed, would erase years of strategic positioning on a plantation where he'd finally found genuine opportunity to save substantial money. It would also likely send him to a frontier region where survival rates were low, where opportunities for earning independent income were minimal, where everything he'd built over nearly a decade would be destroyed, and he'd be starting over in new circumstances with new challenges. Samuel made a desperate, dangerous decision. He would approach Morrison directly with a business proposal that violated numerous social protocols, but represented his best, possibly his only, chance to prevent the sale and keep his family intact.
He requested a meeting through the plantation overseer, a request unusual enough that the overseer initially refused, assuming no enslaved person had anything to say to Morrison that warranted taking the master's time. But Samuel persisted, explaining that he had a business proposal related to the planned Texas sales, and eventually the overseer agreed to arrange a brief meeting. "What is it, Samuel?" Morrison asked when Samuel was brought to his office in the plantation's main house, a room Samuel had never entered before, filled with expensive furniture and books and all the trappings of wealth built on stolen labor. "My overseer says you requested this meeting. I'm curious what you think you need to discuss with me."
Samuel had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, trying to find words that would be persuasive without seeming presumptuous, that would appeal to Morrison's business calculations without directly acknowledging that their relationship was fundamentally about one human owning another. "Master Morrison, I heard my name is on the list for sale to the Texas traders," Samuel began carefully, keeping his voice respectful. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider removing me from that list and letting me purchase myself instead through a payment arrangement. I have $330 saved. I know that's not nearly what you'd get from selling me to Texas. I estimate I'd sell for at least $1,200 given my skills and age. But I want to propose a different arrangement where you profit more than $1,200. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Samuel with genuine surprise. Enslaved people didn't typically approach owners with business proposals. The entire relationship was built on white people making all decisions while black people obeyed without question. But Morrison was also a businessman, always looking for advantageous arrangements. So he gestured for Samuel to continue. "Explain your proposal." "You sell me to Texas, you get a one-time payment of approximately $1,200, Samuel said, speaking the words he'd practiced. "But consider this alternative. I remain here, working as your blacksmith, while paying you $100 per year from my outside work earnings until I've paid $1,500 total. That takes 15 years, which means you receive $1,500 total, $300 more than the Texas sale. Plus, you get the benefit of my blacksmithing skills maintaining your equipment for 15 additional years. The value of my services over 15 years far exceeds the difference between immediate Texas sale and this payment arrangement. You come out ahead financially by a substantial margin, and I eventually freedom." Morrison considered this proposal carefully, his eyes narrowing as he ran calculations. From his perspective, the math was actually favorable in ways Samuel had accurately outlined. Immediate payment of $1,200 from Texas traders versus $1,500 paid over 15 years plus 15 additional years of Samuel's expert equipment maintenance. If Samuel's metalworking skills saved Morrison even $50 annually in equipment costs, a very conservative estimate given how much breakdown costs during grinding season, then Morrison would net an additional $750 over the 15-year period, beyond the higher purchase price. Total gain compared to Texas sale, more than $1,000. The only risks were that Samuel might die or become incapacitated before completing payments, but those risks were offset by the ongoing value of his services and the structure Morrison was already formulating for how to protect his interests. "You'd need to formalize this legally," Morrison said slowly, his tone suggesting he was seriously considering the proposal. "A contract specifying the payment schedule, my rights to your continued labor during the payment period, consequences for default, conditions under which I could terminate the arrangement. My lawyer would draw up documents making this binding. And understand clearly, Samuel, if you miss even a single annual payment, if you default on this arrangement in any way, you're immediately sold to whoever offers the highest price, and you lose every dollar you've paid to that point. This isn't charity or generosity. This is a business transaction where I'm calculating that you're more valuable to me under these specific terms than as a one-time sale. Don't make me regret doing business with you." "I understand completely, Master Morrison,"
Samuel replied, keeping his voice steady despite his heart racing with hope and terror. "I'll meet every payment on schedule and continue providing excellent service. You have my word, and you'll have legal documentation to enforce the arrangement. You won't regret this." Morrison's attorney spent 2 weeks drafting a contract of self-purchase, a legal document rare but not unprecedented in Louisiana law. The contract specified that Samuel Washington agreed to purchase himself from Gregory Morrison for $1,500, payable at $100 per year over 15 years. Samuel would continue working as plantation blacksmith throughout the payment period, would receive the same terms for outside work that he currently enjoyed, 30% of earnings, ability to purchase Sunday time at $2 per day, and would pay his annual installments each January. Upon completion of all 15 payments, Morrison would provide formal manumission documents granting Samuel legal freedom. The contract also specified in explicit detail that failure to make any annual payment by its due date would result in immediate sale of Samuel to any buyer Morrison chose, with all previous payments forfeited as compensation for Morrison's trouble and lost time. Samuel signed the contract in January 1844, making his first payment of $100 from savings he'd accumulated over nearly 10 years of bondage. He was 29 years old, had been enslaved his entire life, had been sold 4 times, and was now entering a 15-year payment plan that, if he survived, if he maintained earning capacity, if he avoided the countless disasters that could destroy enslaved people's carefully laid plans, result in his freedom at age 44. It was simultaneously the most hopeful commitment he'd ever made and the most terrifying, because now his fate was tied to his ability to generate income for 15 consecutive years without any breaks or failures, because default meant losing not just future freedom but also every dollar he'd already paid. "You actually did it," Hannah said that evening, holding baby Rose while Samuel showed her the signed contract. "You negotiated with Morrison and convinced him to let you buy yourself."
I never thought he'd actually agree to those terms. He agreed because he calculated he profits more from this arrangement than from selling me to Texas, Samuel explained, studying the contract's dense legal language. This isn't about Morrison being kind or recognizing my humanity. This is about me making my freedom financially advantageous for him. That's the only way this system ever allows for self-purchase. You have to make yourself so valuable that keeping you under terms that eventually lead to your freedom generates more profit than selling you outright. "What about us?" Hannah asked quietly, her voice carrying all the fear Samuel himself felt. "What about Rose and me? If you make payments for 15 years, you'll be free at 44, but we'll still be enslaved. Morrison could sell us at any time during those 15 years. We could be separated long before you even complete your payments." Samuel had been thinking about exactly this problem constantly since formulating his self-purchase proposal. "Once I'm free, I buy you next," he said firmly, taking Hannah's hands. "I calculate I can save enough to purchase you within 3 to 4 years after getting my own freedom, which would make you free by age 37 or 38. Then we both work to buy Rose. She'd be about 17 or 18 by then. We all get free eventually, just in stages rather than all at once. It's not perfect, Hannah. There's serious risk of separation, risk that something goes wrong during those years. But it's the best path I can see. It's a strategy that might actually work if we execute it carefully and if we're lucky enough to avoid disasters." Hannah was silent for a long moment, processing the timeline Samuel outlined. 19 to 22 years before their family would all be legally free, assuming everything went according to plan and nothing disrupted their strategy. It was simultaneously an eternity and their best realistic hope given the constraints of the system they lived under. "All right," she finally said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "We do it your way. You make your payments, earn your freedom, then buy us. We'll survive that long. We have to believe we'll survive that long. The 15 years of payment became the most intensely focused period of Samuel's life. He worked Morrison's equipment with obsessive attention to excellence, ensuring no failures that might give Morrison reason to question the arrangement or terminate the contract. He took every outside work opportunity available, traveling throughout Lafourche Parish and neighboring areas, building reputation as the best blacksmith in the region, the person planters called when they had complex problems or urgent repairs that couldn't wait. From taking on jobs that other smiths considered too difficult or time-consuming, every dollar represented hours of work, strategic thinking about how to maximize value from his limited time and energy, careful navigation of a system designed to extract his labor while giving him minimum return. By 1851, Samuel had paid $900, 3/5 of the total amount. He was 36 years old, had been working under this contract for 8 years, had 7 more annual payments remaining before achieving freedom. The goal that had seemed impossible when his mother first taught him about strategic survival 17 years earlier was now genuinely achievable. Not achieved yet, 7 years remained and many things could still go wrong, but close enough that Samuel could realistically imagine walking into Morrison's office in 7 more years, making that final payment, receiving manumission documents, becoming legally free. Hannah was now 40 years old. Rose was 9. They'd survived together as a family for a decade, defying the separations that destroyed most enslaved families. Samuel's strategic value to Morrison's operations, combined with Morrison's calculations about maintaining Samuel's motivation to complete payments, had provided some protection from sale. It was cruel calculation that treated a black family's unity as an economic asset to be preserved only when preservation served the enslaver's financial interests, but it also meant they'd avoided the forcible separations that tore apart most enslaved families during that period. In January 1852, Samuel made his 10th payment, 5 remaining. He was 37 years old, had worked for 23 years since his first sale at 19, had been sold 4 times to 4 different enslavers, had accumulated metalworking skills and mechanical knowledge and strategic wisdom through years of observation and learning. He'd maintained focus on a single long-term goal through circumstances that would have broken most people's spirits. He'd built a family and kept that family together through a system designed to destroy black familial bonds. He'd saved and worked and calculated and persisted through countless obstacles and close calls. In January 1853, Samuel made his 11th payment, 4 remaining. The end was visible now, close enough to see clearly, close enough to start planning for what freedom would actually mean practically. How would he operate as a free black person in Louisiana? Where would he live? How would he generate income without Morrison's plantation as his base? How quickly could he save enough to purchase Hannah after getting free himself? These questions became urgent rather than theoretical as freedom approached. In January 1854, Samuel made his 12th payment, 3 remaining. Halfway through his 30s, he could see his 40s approaching, the decade when he would transition from enslaved to free, when everything about his life would fundamentally change. He began teaching Rose more intensively, preparing her for the reality that he would be free while she remained enslaved for several more years, preparing her to understand why that separation was necessary as part of the longer strategy of liberating their whole family. In January 1855, Samuel made his 13th payment, 2 remaining. The goal was so close now that he could almost touch it, could almost taste freedom, could almost imagine what it would feel like to own himself legally instead of being owned by someone else. But proximity to the goal also made him more cautious, more careful, more afraid of doing anything that might jeopardize the arrangement this late in the process. He worked with even more obsessive attention to quality, took no risks, avoided any situation that might give Morrison cause to question the contract. In January 1856, Samuel made his 14th payment, 1 remaining. 12 more months until freedom. A year that felt simultaneously short. Just 12 more months of this relentless work. Just 1 more payment,
and impossibly long, because any number of disasters could occur in 12 months that might destroy everything at the last moment before completion. Samuel worked those final 12 months with the same obsessive attention he'd maintained throughout the 15-year period, taking no chances, avoiding all risks, ensuring his final year would pass without incident. And then, in January 1857, Samuel Washington made his final payment to Gregory Morrison. $1,500 paid over 15 years, plus the value of his blacksmithing services throughout that period, plus rent he'd paid for Sunday work time, plus uncountable hours of his life devoted to this goal. Morrison had profited handsomely from the arrangement, far more than the immediate Texas sale would have generated in 1843. Samuel had paid an enormous sum for what should have been his birthright as a human being. But within the evil system that governed their lives, within laws that defined him as property rather than person, the transaction was complete. Morrison's lawyer prepared manumission documents certifying that Samuel Washington, Negro male aged 42, the lawyer got his age slightly wrong, Samuel was actually 41, was hereby freed from slavery and granted rights and privileges available to free persons of color in the state of Louisiana. The documents were properly notarized, filed with parish authorities, recorded in official ledgers. Samuel received his certified copy of the papers, physical proof of freedom, legal documentation that couldn't be easily revoked, the achievement of a goal he'd been working towards since his mother taught him about strategic survival 23 years earlier. "You're free," Hannah said that evening, holding the manumission papers with trembling hands while 13-year-old Rose looked on trying to understand what this moment meant. "You actually did it, Samuel. You bought yourself. You're legally free."
Samuel held the papers carefully, these documents that represented everything he'd worked for. But his expression was thoughtful rather than purely celebratory. He'd learned over 23 years and 4 sales not to celebrate prematurely, not to assume anything was permanent or secure. "I'm free," he agreed quietly. "But you and Rose aren't yet. This is 1/3 of the goal, not completion. Now comes the next phase, working to buy your freedom, then Rose's. I calculate I can save enough to purchase you within 4 or 5 years if I work efficiently and if economic conditions stay favorable. Rose would be another 7 or 8 years after that if I have to buy both of you with just my earnings. We're not done yet. We're just entering a new phase of the same long strategy." But being legally free, even with his family still enslaved, changed Samuel's circumstances dramatically in ways that would accelerate the timeline he'd outlined. As a free black man, he could negotiate openly for work rather than operating through Morrison's arrangement. He could charge market rates for his blacksmithing services rather than being limited to whatever percentage an enslaver permitted him to keep. He could accumulate money much more quickly than during his years of bondage. He could also travel more freely. Not without restrictions. Louisiana and most southern states had laws limiting free black people's movements and rights, but with significantly more mobility than enslaved people possessed. Samuel established himself as an independent blacksmith in Thibodaux, Louisiana, renting a small shop and living quarters from a free black property owner, positioning himself at a commercial crossroads where he could serve multiple parishes. He continued taking jobs throughout the region, building on the reputation he'd established during his enslaved years, when plantation owners had learned to trust his expertise. And he saved with the same obsessive focus he'd maintained throughout the payment period, now working toward Hannah's purchase. Gregory Morrison set Hannah's purchase price at $900, less than Samuel's had been, because she was older now and her seamstress skills, while valuable, were less economically critical than expert blacksmithing. Samuel calculated he could save enough to purchase her within 3 to 4 years if his business remained steady and he maintained absolutely minimal living expenses, investing almost everything he earned toward her freedom. Those 3.5 years tested Samuel in different ways than the 15-year payment period had. He was free, but his wife and daughter remained enslaved, remained Morrison's property, remained subject to all the vulnerabilities that enslaved people faced. He could visit them regularly, Morrison permitted this because he calculated that maintaining Samuel's connection to his family ensured Samuel would complete Hannah's purchase. But each visit ended with separation, with Samuel returning to his free existence while his wife and daughter remained in bondage. The guilt of being free while they weren't was intense, even though Samuel understood intellectually that his freedom was the prerequisite for theirs. But Samuel also experienced something profound during those years, the reality of being a free black person in the antebellum South. Freedom wasn't what he'd imagined during 15 years of working toward it. He wasn't truly free in any meaningful sense. Free black people in Louisiana faced extensive legal restrictions on where they could live, how they could work, where they could travel, what legal rights they possessed. They were required to carry freedom papers at all times and could be arrested and enslaved if caught without proper documentation. They faced constant harassment from white people who resented free black existence as a challenge to white supremacy. They had to navigate complex social dynamics where any perceived disrespect toward white people could result in violence or re-enslavement through fraudulent legal processes. But it was still better than being enslaved. Samuel owned his own labor, controlled his own time, made his own decisions about how to live his life within the constraints that existed. He could walk down streets without an overseer watching. He could refuse work he didn't want to do. He could save money without anyone claiming ownership of his earnings. These were real freedoms, even if they were limited freedoms, even if they didn't constitute full citizenship or equality or justice. In July 1860, 44 months after achieving his own freedom, Samuel accumulated $900 through relentless work and minimal spending. He returned to Morrison's plantation with the full amount in gold and silver coins, negotiated Hannah's purchase using the carefully saved money, received her manumission papers just as he'd received his own 3.5 years earlier. Hannah was 49 years old, had been enslaved her entire life, had survived decades of bondage, and was now free. The family was 2/3 liberated. "Mama's free!" 18-year-old Rose exclaimed when Hannah returned from Morrison's office with her manumission papers, her face radiant with joy, but also complicated by understanding that she remained enslaved while her parents were free. "Now you both work to buy me." "Now we work together to buy you," Samuel confirmed, holding his daughter close. "Your mother and I, both free, both working, saving together. You're 18 now. I calculate we can save enough to purchase you within 4 or 5 years if we work efficiently and avoid major setbacks. You'll be 22 or 23 when we buy your freedom, still young enough to have a full life ahead of you as a free woman, young enough to marry and have children who'll be born free instead of born enslaved." But then, in November 1860, national events intervened in ways that would change everything. Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform opposing slavery's expansion into Western territories. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December, followed by 6 more Southern states over the following weeks. Louisiana seceded in January 1861. By April, the nation had descended into civil war, with Confederate states fighting to preserve slavery and Union forces ultimately fighting to destroy it. The war created chaos that threatened Samuel's carefully laid plans, while simultaneously offering unexpected opportunities. Gregory Morrison became increasingly reluctant to sell enslaved people during wartime uncertainty, concerned that he'd need maximum labor to maintain operations during economic disruption. When Samuel approached Morrison in March 1861 with $1,000 saved toward Rose's purchase, Morrison initially refused to complete the sale. "Prices are too uncertain right now," Morrison said. "I need to see how this war develops before making decisions about selling workers. Contact me again after the situation stabilizes." But the situation didn't stabilize. It deteriorated rapidly as war intensified. Samuel and Hannah found themselves in a terrible position. They'd accumulated money necessary for their daughter's freedom, but were blocked from completing the transaction by circumstances beyond their control. Rose remained enslaved while her parents were free, a separation that became increasingly intolerable as months passed and the war showed no signs of quick resolution. In September 1861, Samuel made a dangerous, desperate decision.
"We're leaving Louisiana," he told Hannah. "We're going to take Rose and travel north toward Union-controlled territories where slavery's being abolished, where Lincoln's government is moving toward emancipation. We've bought our freedom legally, mine and yours. We have the papers to prove it. We've accumulated the money to buy Rose, but Morrison won't complete the sale. If we can't buy her freedom through the system, then we remove ourselves from the system's jurisdiction. It's risky, but staying here while the war rages and Rose remains enslaved feels like a bigger risk." "Morrison will say Rose is stolen property," Hannah said, fear evident in her voice. "If Confederate authorities catch us helping her escape, they could re-enslave all three of us, regardless of our free papers. This could destroy everything we've built over 27 years. "Everything we've built over 27 years is meaningless if Rose stays enslaved," Samuel replied firmly.
"I didn't work for 23 years to buy my freedom and another 4 years to buy yours, just so we could live free while our daughter remains in bondage. We go north, we take Rose, we get to Union territory where emancipation is happening, and we start over as a free family. That's the only plan that makes sense now." In October 1861, Samuel and Hannah Washington, along with their 19-year-old daughter Rose, left Louisiana and began traveling north toward Union-controlled territories. They carried their manumission papers, the $1,000 they'd saved for Rose's purchase, tools of their trades, and the determination that had sustained them through 27 years since Samuel's first sale. They traveled mostly at night, used underground railroad networks when they could connect with them, presented themselves as free black people traveling on legitimate business when necessary, and eventually reached Cairo, Illinois, where Union forces controlled the Mississippi River and where slavery had been abolished. From Cairo, they traveled to Cincinnati, Ohio, a city with an established free black community and active abolitionist networks that helped formerly enslaved people establish new lives in freedom. Samuel and Hannah used their skills and their saved money to establish a blacksmith shop and seamstress business that could support their family. Rose, who'd learned metalworking from her father, worked alongside Samuel while also pursuing education that had been denied her in Louisiana. The Civil War ended in April 1865 with the Confederacy's defeat and slavery's abolition throughout the United States through the 13th Amendment. Rose, who'd left Louisiana enslaved and reached Ohio free by circumstance rather than by completed legal purchase, was now legally free regardless of Morrison's refusal to complete the sale. The system that had governed the Washington family's entire existence had collapsed, destroyed by its own contradictions and by the war those contradictions had generated. Samuel Washington died in Cincinnati in 1878 at age 63, having lived 17 years as a legally free man after 41 years in bondage. He'd been sold 4 times to 4 different enslavers, had worked under those men and for himself for more than 4 decades, had bought himself through a 15-year payment plan, had bought his wife, had attempted to buy his daughter before the system collapsed and made such purchases unnecessary. He'd accumulated extraordinary metalworking skills, mechanical knowledge, strategic wisdom, and resources through years of patient persistence towards seemingly impossible goals. He'd maintained his humanity through dehumanizing circumstances, had built a family and kept that family together through a system designed to destroy black families, had achieved something remarkable not because the system permitted it, but because he'd navigated that system brilliantly enough to exploit its few available opportunities. His story wasn't typical of enslaved people's experiences. Most never had opportunities to accumulate resources necessary for self-purchase, never encountered enslavers willing to negotiate payment arrangements, never survived long enough to complete multi-year payment plans, never developed the specific combination of skills and circumstances that made Samuel's achievement possible. Most enslaved people died in bondage, were worked to death in fields or sold away from families or killed by disease or violence, never experiencing even one day of legal freedom. Samuel's story was possible only because he possessed extraordinary ability combined with specific favorable circumstances, because he encountered enslavers whose business calculations occasionally aligned with his freedom goals, because he survived when countless others died.
But Samuel's story was also exemplary in demonstrating what black people could achieve when given even minimal opportunity, how brilliantly they could think strategically, how persistently they could work toward long-term goals, how thoroughly they could maintain humanity and purpose through circumstances designed to destroy both. His 15-year payment plan represented more than financial transaction. It represented his mother's teachings about strategic survival passed down the night before his first sale, his father's wisdom about understanding systems and playing long games, countless hours of work and thought and planning and persistence across decades. The leather pouch Samuel carried into attorney Jacob Miller's office in Richmond in 1849, the pouch containing money he'd saved through years of bondage, represented more than currency. It represented knowledge accumulated over 15 years of bondage about how to navigate an evil system, about how to make yourself valuable enough that enslavers would negotiate, about how to balance appearing compliant while maintaining inner resistance, about how to survive with purpose rather than just enduring day to day. It represented the determination to be not just the victim of 4 sales, but the final purchaser of himself, to transform from property to person through mechanisms available within the system itself. When Samuel Washington signed those manumission papers in Gregory Morrison's office in January 1857, when he legally became the owner of himself after 15 years of systematic payments, he accomplished something that should never have been necessary. He shouldn't have needed to purchase what was his birthright as a human being. He shouldn't have had to work for 15 years earning money to buy himself from someone who never had legitimate ownership of him in any moral sense. The fact that self-purchase was necessary reveals the profound evil of the system, not its benevolence or flexibility.
But Samuel's achievement also demonstrated something profound about human resilience, about strategic intelligence, about the refusal to be broken even in circumstances designed to break people. He proved that even within systems constructed to deny black humanity, black people maintained their full humanity and used whatever limited opportunities existed to work toward freedom. He demonstrated that resistance could take forms beyond physical rebellion, that strategic planning, patient accumulation of resources, careful navigation of oppressive systems, maintenance of long-term goals across decades all constituted legitimate and sometimes effective resistance. The lesson Samuel Washington's life teaches isn't that enslavement was acceptable or that enslaved people just needed to work hard enough to buy themselves. The vast majority had no such opportunities regardless of how hard they worked. The lesson is about the extraordinary capability of people who maintained purpose and strategic focus through circumstances that would break most people's spirits. It's about intelligence, persistence, strategic thinking across decades. It's about family bonds strong enough to survive separations and sales and years of enforced distance. It's about the human spirit's capacity to maintain hope and work towards seemingly impossible goals across spans of time that would test anyone's faith. Samuel Washington's story reminds us that resistance to oppression takes many forms, not just physical resistance, not just escape or rebellion, though those forms were important and brave and necessary, but also the quiet, persistent, strategic resistance of accumulating resources penny by penny, of developing skills that increased market value, of navigating an evil system brilliantly enough to eventually use that system's own mechanisms for self-liberation. Samuel resisted by refusing to accept that 4 sales defined his entire future, by working for more than 20 years toward a goal that seemed impossible but eventually proved achievable, by maintaining his humanity and his family bonds through circumstances designed to destroy both. His story also reminds us of what was stolen from the millions who never had Samuel's opportunities. How many brilliant minds were never given chances to develop valuable skills? How many strategic thinkers were worked to death before they could accumulate any resources? How many families were separated permanently, never able to reunite? How many people died in bondage despite possessing Samuel's intelligence and determination simply because they never encountered the specific circumstances that created opportunities for self-purchase?
Samuel's achievement highlights what was possible when narrow opportunities existed, which simultaneously highlights the enormity of what was destroyed when such opportunities didn't exist, which was almost always, which was the experience of the vast majority. We honor Samuel Washington not by pretending his story was typical or easily replicable, but by understanding what it reveals about both human capability and systemic evil. We honor him by recognizing that his self-purchase, while remarkable, was only necessary because of profound injustice that should never have existed. We honor him by understanding that his story represents both what Black people could achieve when given minimal opportunity and what was stolen from millions who never had such opportunities, despite being equally intelligent, equally determined, equally deserving of freedom. We honor Samuel by remembering his strategic brilliance, his patient persistence across more than 2 decades, his maintenance of humanity through dehumanizing circumstances, his building and preservation of family bonds through a system that tried to make Black families impossible. We honor him by understanding that freedom purchased after 41 years of bondage, while meaningful and hard-won, represents 41 years that should never have been stolen. We honor him by remembering that the money he saved represented stolen wages from labor that should have been compensated fairly rather than being extracted through enslavement. We honor Samuel Washington by telling his story, by ensuring that future generations know about the brilliant strategist who bought himself through patient accumulation of resources across 15 years, who navigated an evil system skillfully enough to exploit its few available opportunities for self-liberation. We honor him by understanding that his story is one thread in the vast tapestry of Black resistance to slavery, that millions of others resisted in their own ways, even when those ways didn't lead to legal freedom, that resistance was constant and multifaceted, even when it was invisible to white observers or to later historians. If Samuel Washington's extraordinary 27-year journey from first sale to his family's freedom moved you, if his strategic intelligence and persistent focus on seemingly impossible goals inspired you, if you understand now how enslaved people navigated bondage through brilliant long-term planning and patient resistance, then I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel and smash that notification bell. We bring you the most powerful forgotten stories of Black excellence, courage, and genius every single week. Stories of ancestors whose strategies and wisdom still teach us. Stories that deserve to go viral because they honor lives that mattered then and matter now. Share this video with someone who needs to know that resistance takes many forms, that strategic thinking across decades can achieve goals that seem impossible, that maintaining humanity despite systematic dehumanization is itself revolutionary. Leave a comment telling us what Samuel's story means to you personally, how it changes your understanding of how enslaved people navigated bondage, what lessons from his life you'll carry forward into your own struggles and goals. These stories matter. These lives matter. This history matters. Remember that freedom achieved through years of strategic work and patient accumulation of resources represents both remarkable human achievement and the profound injustice that made such achievement necessary, that made it necessary for a man to purchase what should have been his birthright. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another powerful story that deserves to be remembered, shared, and celebrated across the world.